Welcome to Hit the Mark, a podcast presented by CK Magic Sports, who along with Man and Dog Productions, we are the first in sports education.
Greetings everyone and welcome to the CK Magic Sports Podcast. My name is Mark Kelly and along with Man and Dog Productions, we are the first in sports education. So, a little background on myself. This being the very first podcast, I wanted to give you guys an idea of who I am and what my accomplishments have been. I am a former researcher at ESPN. I've won 2 Emmy Awards for my work on SportsCenter, Baseball Tonight, college basketball, ESPN News, and Cold Pizza. And the point of this podcast is to be a little different than some of the other podcasts out there who I think just the information is lacking on some of them. It's a little too much based on fluff and witty comments. Well, although it's not like I'm not witty, but I think I want this podcast to be more about information and breaking down sports to its essentials and getting down to the nitty-gritty. If you are a true sports fan and you love to talk about sports and be educated on past events as well as current, I guarantee you, over the course of listening to my podcast, you will become one of the most informed people of any room you enter, which the conversation is based on sports. As we enter the final week of February and Black History Month, today's podcast is going to be talking about the black athlete. Most everyone knows about Jackie Robinson breaking the color barrier in baseball in 1947. So this podcast will focus on some of the lesser-known pioneers and how they contributed to their sport. We're going to start in the sport of horse racing. Now, today the black African-American jockey is not that prevalent. As a matter of fact, of the roughly 1,000 jockeys racing on thoroughbreds in the United States, only 50 are black, according to the Jockey Guild. So when I tell you that the black jockey dominated this sport at one time, I could see it might be hard for you to believe. Now, horse racing dates back to colonial times. The British brought their passion for the sport to the New World. From the 1600s to the turn of the 20th century, the business was basically dominated by African Americans. Why? Because the feeding, the grooming, the exercising, the breaking, and the training of the horses were the duties of skilled slaves. And when it came time to race the horses, the slaves were the natural choice to do so. So blacks basically ruled the sport in America, but they also were able to compete abroad. Now, abroad they were treated more like celebrities, and compare that to how they were treated in the United States, it was just very different. So, 1875, the very first Kentucky Derby, 13 of the 15 horses were ridden by black jockeys. The winner was a jockey by the name of Oliver Lewis, a 19-year-old African-American native Kentuckian who rode a horse called Aristides, a chestnut colt trained by a former slave, to a record-setting victory for a 3-year-old. From 1875 to 1902, of those 28 races, 15 of them were won by African Americans. One of the greatest jockeys during that time was a jockey by the name of Isaac Murphy. Now, Murphy was the first to win consecutive derbies in 1890 and 1891 and went on to win an amazing 44% of his races. Now, that is a winning percentage that is the highest of all time, and I promise you it will most likely never be equaled. Okay? So, why did that change? Okay, why in today's society are black jockeys not that common? Well, basically you had the sport dominated in the South by African Americans back then, and in the North they were dominated by immigrants, okay? So you have the European immigrants, and they are kind of resentful of the black man's success at horse racing. So they began to force the blacks, and in some cases literally force the blacks, off the track. In 1900, white jockeys in New York told their trainers and owners not to mount black riders if they expected to win. During races, white riders boxed in black jockeys and rode them into and often over rails. If you can believe this, they even used their whips against black jockeys, their horse whips against black jockeys during the races. Now, I don't need to tell you that being whipped is not exactly good memories for African Americans. So this is just some of the disgusting practices that took place, which is why you saw the numbers of black jockeys dwindle. So the owners came to see that, and they saw that the black riders had very little chance of winning as long as the white riders were stooping to this disgusting level. So, even the famed Willie Sims, who was the only African American to win each of the Triple Crown races. Now, the Kentucky Derby was the last of the Preakness and the Belmont Stakes to join the Triple Crown, since both of those races started before 1875. Okay, so realistically, the Triple Crown started in 1875. It wasn't given that name, I think, until 1923. But basically, you have all three races taking place since 1875, and Sims is the only African American jockey to win each of the Triple Crown races. Now, even he had to beg for a mount. So by 1904, black jockeys had basically disappeared from the major racetracks, and especially Churchill Downs. So the last time a black rode in the Kentucky Derby before the year 2000, when Marlon St. Julien rode his horse to a 7th-place finish, was 1921. So from 1921 to 2000, no African Americans rode in a Kentucky Derby, a sport that was at one time dominated by African Americans. Now in 2013, Kevin Krieger rode his horse to an 8th-place finish. So since 1921, only 2 African Americans have participated in a Kentucky Derby. When you compare that to how African Americans dominated this sport at its inception, and a Kentucky Derby at its inception, I just wanted to give you some sort of comparison as to the accomplishments and the skills of African Americans. And just because they are no longer competing in that sport doesn't mean that they don't have the skill to do so. Moving from horse racing to basketball. Now, the NBA did not start officially until the 1946-47 season, when it started as the BAA, the Basketball Association of America. It did not get the name NBA until the 1949-50 season. Before that, African Americans were basically restricted to barnstorming leagues. The New York Rens, which were a very popular basketball team from Harlem, that would play in reception halls and dance halls, that sort of thing. This is what the African American athlete was restricted to from the start of the NBA until the NBA integrated in the 1950-51 season. Now, in that season, the very first draft which allowed black people to be drafted was in April of 1950. Basically, 3 players broke the NBA color barrier. It's kind of hard to give just one of them credit because there were basically 3 levels of how they broke into the league. Chuck Cooper was the first player to be drafted. The Boston Celtics drafted him in the 2nd round of the 1950 NBA draft. A player by the name of Nat Sweetwater Clifton, who played for both the New York Rens and the Harlem Globetrotters before coming to the NBA. He was the first to sign an NBA contract and actually appear in a game. There was another player who signed an NBA contract but was cut in training camp, so he really doesn't count. But Clifton was the first to sign a contract and actually play in the NBA. Now, he signed his contract with the Knicks on May 24th of 1950. And the final member of that trioca is a person by the name of Earl Lloyd. Now, Lloyd was the first to appear in an NBA game. He took to court on October 30th, 1950, for the Washington Capitals against the Rochester Royals. So today, now, if you can imagine that the NBA integrating in 1950-51, you look at the league today where over 3/4 of the players are African American, which is the highest in any sport. It's important that when we remember, when we look at the NBA today, we remember that there was once a time when that was not the case. And these players, who were the pioneers of breaking the color barrier, definitely deserve some recognition. Now, Larry Bird, who was possibly the greatest white player to ever play in the NBA, himself says that the NBA is a black man's game, and that the greatest athletes in the world are African American. Moving from basketball to women's tennis, we come across an athlete by the name of Althea Gibson. Now, Gibson was the first African American woman to compete on the World Tennis Tour when she participated in Wimbledon in 1951. She won her first Grand Slam at the French Open in 1956, then won Wimbledon and the U.S. Nationals, the precursor to the U.S. Open, in both 1957 and 1958. So she won both those tournaments in consecutive years. Overall, Gibson won 5 Grand Slam titles and 56 singles and doubles championships before turning pro in 1959. Now, Gibson not only made history in tennis, but she also made history in 1963 when she became the first African-American woman to join the LPGA. Now, she never had the kind of success at golf that she had in tennis, and she eventually faded off the tour in the 70s, but she improved each year she competed, and those who played with her on tour in the LPGA spoke very... they just gave her so many compliments, and they were just blown away by the improvement that she made from year to year. So the Williams sisters, especially today, the Williams sisters get a lot of attention and publicity when it comes to African American women and accomplishments in tennis. But it's important to remember that Althea Gibson was not only the first to break ground in tennis, but she also created opportunities for African Americans in the LPGA. So, just to give you the idea of the type of an athlete Gibson was, it's not every day that you're able to compete professionally in 2 different sports. Bo Jackson gets recognition for when he played football and baseball in the 80s and 90s, but back then, Gibson was the so-called, Bo Jackson of her time in the women's game, being able to break ground in not only tennis, but also golf. Finally, we end our podcast going from women's tennis to boxing. In boxing, there was a athlete by the name of George Dixon. Now, Dixon was short in stature. He was just 5'3", and he weighed only 87 pounds. But he is considered one of the greatest boxers of all time. Nicknamed Little Chocolate, and he was born in Canada, he became the first African American to win an American championship when he won the World Bantamweight Championship in 1890. He further cemented his place in boxing history when he won the featherweight title in 1891, when he beat a boxer by the name of Cal McCarthy in 22 rounds. Now, you got to remember, too, that you hear 22 rounds for boxing, you think that this guy must be Superman. But back then, a lot of fights, that was the norm, to go longer, 15, 16. Some boxing matches went, 30, 40 rounds. I have no idea how the endurance of these guys pulled it off, but, when you hear 22 rounds in today's boxing, it's almost impossible to imagine. But back then, that was more of the norm. So Dixon, being now holding two titles, also remember that he was the first African American to win a championship in the United States of any kind. So that itself was very groundbreaking. Now, Dixon's official record shows that he fought in 158 bouts, but that record fails to record the actual number of fights he had, as many were staged in dance halls and theaters around the country, a lot like those barnstorming basketball games. There was really no official way to record them. Now, his manager, who traveled with him, claimed before his death that Dixon had over 800 fights. Now, sometimes fighting up to 15 times a week. Imagine that. I mean, today, boxers don't fight, every 3 months, and then they got to train, all that. So this guy, 15 times a week, just to give you an idea of the shape that this guy was in. When one of the National Police Gazette indicates that he had over 1,000 fights, but that might be stretching it. But this record is really unparalleled in the history of sports, and it's just an unbelievable number of fights that this guy participated in. Also, Dixon is recognized for popularizing shadowboxing. If you can imagine that. I mean, just look at how many boxers today use that technique. Now, Dixon wasn't the only groundbreaking athlete in his sport. There was another boxer at the same time, maybe a little bit later, by the name of Jack Johnson. Now, Johnson is a little more celebrated than Dixon is. And Johnson was basically Muhammad Ali before Muhammad Ali. Now, he didn't have the access to media that Ali had, so maybe he would have been more vocal. But definitely in his lifestyle, Johnson was very brash and a very confident boxer. Now, he became the first African American to win the world heavyweight crown when he knocked out Tommy Burns in 1908. Now, Johnson was hated by the white community because of his flamboyant lifestyle, and he flaunted things like dating white women. And after becoming champ, people were calling for him to get defeated, and the guy they wanted to see him defeat him was the former champion by the name of Jim Jeffries. Jeffries, for a long time, put off the fight. He had retired. He didn't really want to fight, but he agreed to come back, and on July 4th, 1910, he fought Johnson in what was dubbed the fight of the century. Now, more than 22,000 fans, back in those days, that's a lot of people, came to the fight in Reno, Nevada. After 15 rounds, Johnson came away victorious, affirming his domain over boxing and, just enraging the white boxing fans who wanted to see him get pummeled. And they just couldn't take seeing a black man, a proud black man nonetheless, an outspoken black man, sitting atop the sport of boxing. Now, back then, 117,000 was an unthinkable amount. Even today's society, $117,000 is a lot of money, but that's how much money Johnson earned for the fight. So add that to the anger that white people felt seeing a black man earn that type of money. Now, Johnson also got himself into a little trouble because of his lifestyle, and I think they were out to get him and basically paid attention to every little thing he did. Well, back then there was a law called the Mann Act, which a black man was not allowed to bring a white across state borders before they were married, or in this case he brought his girlfriend across state lines, which was a crime back then. So he was then sentenced to prison, but he fled to Europe, and then he remained there as a fugitive for 7 years. He returned to the United States in 1920 and ultimately served out his sentence going on to fight another 12 years before hanging up his gloves for good at the age of 50. Now, Johnson tragically died in a car crash that ended his life, but this guy was really before his time, and I know that Muhammad Ali draws a lot of comparisons to Jack Johnson. In conclusion, I did this podcast today to highlight some of the lesser known African Americans who were pioneers of their sport. Most people know about Jackie Robinson's sacrifice and contributions, and a lot of people know about the sacrifices of Jesse Owens. But these athletes and the role they played in their sport, they definitely deserve to be recognized.
Remember to follow Mark on Facebook and Twitter at CK Magic Sports. Subscribe on iTunes and YouTube, and find Mark on the web at ckmagicsports.com. If you'd like to support CK Magic Sports, donate at patreon.com. Thank you for listening. Hope you tune in next week.